Thank you so very much for that lovely improvised beginning, and to everyone for joining us on May 4th. Now, in probably trying to be too clever for my own good, I tried to embrace Star Wars Day in introducing you all to today's performers and panellists, and the result was somewhat more artistic, but perhaps more representational than I'd intended. Those of us sharing ideas and improvisations with you all today have worked together in different capacities and different contexts, relationships that are still in motion. So thank you first to our masters and third year students, Lachlan, Alexandra and Joe Machin, for our musical opening. And our panellists today include Senior Lecturer Dr. Chris Stovo, alumna and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Queensland, Charulatha Mani, doctoral candidate Daniel Hirsch, and alum and postdoctoral researcher at Macquarie University, Reardon-Smith. The session will be chaired by myself, Alexis, Kallio. I am Deputy Director for Research here at the Queensland Conservatorium. And our time will close with an improvisation by doctoral candidates Flora, Wong, and Alexandra Gorton. Together, we ask today what it means to improvise new music in a world already saturated by history, information, and sound. Few places in the world are more saturated with history than where we gather today, the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to extend our respect to elders past and present who have survived invasion and dispossession to realise a future for some of the richest histories, most complex knowledge systems, and oldest musical traditions in the world. Just as musical improvisations always take place somewhere, sometime, and in relation to others, We extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today and later online, as well as those that we live and work together with in our universities and broader communities. And so, to kick our discussion off today, each of our panelists will share some brief offerings and thoughts before we engage in a bit more of discussion and open it up to questions as well. So to kick us off, we'll have Christopher.
Thanks, Alexis, and thanks, Lachlan. And I think there are actually some really interesting connections between what you all were just doing and what I'm about to talk about. I'm going to begin today by describing 5 potential metaphors for thinking through what it is that musicians in Black radical traditions do with their source materials. And so the first of these comes from the novelist and poet Nathaniel Mackey, who's there in your lower right, who describes the relationship between a jazz musician's source material, the Tin Pan Alley songs and the Broadway show tunes and so on, what he describes as banal material, and the alchemical transformations that take place when jazz musicians do what they do with these materials. So this concept of alchemy is my first metaphor. What this does, I think, is it adds to what is already what we might call the combination of material, social, and political dimensions of any kind of musical expression, adds a 4th dimension, which is what we might call a mystical or spiritual dimension. And in doing so, suggesting that all of these are manifestations of a single animating force that the act of jazz improvisation, according to Mackey, calls into being. So the alchemical transformation as the calling into being of a constellation of material, social, political, and mystical forces. My second metaphor is what I call the concept of syntactical torsion. And what I mean by that, if we think of a musical syntax as a system of preference rules for generating meaningful utterances within a discursive community, to take that syntax and wrench it open, to deliberately and violently wrench it open in order to see what other kinds of expressions could be made possible by doing so that are not already performable within the confines of the original syntactic borders. And so this connects with some language from the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, where they talk about what they call a minor language. And this is my third metaphor, is the concept of a minor language. A minor language they describe as, quote, that which a minority constructs within a major language. And in doing so this is the seizing of a major language and in a very similar way to the torsion I was describing, redirecting that language into other kinds of expressions that, again, weren't possible within the original procedural apparatus. And so Deleuze and Guattari described 3 characteristics of a minor language, the first of which is that it is, quote, affected with a high coefficient of deterritorialization. The second is that it is essentially and always political. And the third is that within a minor language, everything takes on a collective value, meaning there's no such thing within a minoritarian expression of there being a single isolated utterer. Everything is connected. Everything is an expression of communal, communitarian, relational kinds of forces. My fourth metaphor, and you can see there's some themes emerging in all of these, is the concept of what Fred Moten calls the break, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the cut. And this is what this draws upon what I think is a very provocative and quite dynamic definition of black expression provided by Fred Moten, where he says black expression is, quote, the extended movement of a specific upheaval and ongoing eruption that unarranges every line. And he plays with these words in all kinds of really interesting and provocative kind of ways. The concept of eruption, the concept of unarrangement, which is to destabilize the kind of arrangements that are already present within a linguistic formation. And the cut, according to, or the break, according to Saidiya Hartman, is the scene of the disruption of representation. So it's moving away from the idea that language is a kind of representational apparatus and moving it into the space of being a deliberately productive apparatus. And I'm going to suggest in a moment that that's what jazz has the capacity to do. And all of this then leads to my fifth metaphor, which is the kind of global metaphor that holds over all of these, which is the possibility that Afro-diasporic improvisational practices can be, and maybe need to be, a form of liberatory politics. So, a lot has been written about this over the last 6+ decades, about the potential or possibilities of African American and other kinds of Afro-diasporic expressions as expressions of liberatory politics. So I want to ask, first of all, what happens if we take this metaphor seriously? What work does thinking through improvisational practices as liberatory politics do? But then also, what if we insist that what I'm now going to phrase as a big conjunctive, minoritarian alchemical torsion that wrenches open a break or gap through which a fugitive line of escape can occur? What happens if we take this non-metaphorically? What happens if we insist, following Tuck and Yang, that all of this is not a metaphor? And so this speaks to what to impassioned calls from Black studies scholars like Sylvia Wynter and Elsa Barkley Brown, who ask us to resist what we might call the reverse alchemical transposition of radical Black politics into neoliberalized forms like diversity initiatives and quote-unquote ethnic studies. And so this then, I'll take about 1 more minute, this is going to lead to my actual provocation, since we're asked to provide some provocations today. So I'm just gonna read the last bit of my presentation here. So this is my provocation. To borrow from Sylvia Wynter, it's abundantly clear that as jazz learning and teaching has become fully neoliberalized, formalized, and displaced from its restless anti-establishment roots. And here I'm positioning jazz specifically as far and away the most visible improvisatory practice found in most institutional tertiary music education contexts. So to paraphrase Sylvia Wynter, jazz practices have found, quote, their original transgressive intentions diffused, their energies rechanneled as they came to be defined in new multicultural terms. As such, this field appears as but one of many diverse ethnic studies that now serve to re-verify the very thesis of liberal universalism against which its challenges had been directed in the first place, end quote. Or more succinctly, institutional forces have co-opted jazz's movements, quote, sanitized of their original heretical dynamic into a liberal universalist mainstream, end quote. And this was all built around a reluctance and eventually a refusal to see a relationship between the production of knowledge and the liberation of people. And so my question for today is, how can we reclaim the radically exploratory, knowledge-producing, emancipatory registers of jazz's initial promise as, specifically, a space of refusal of the 21st century university's neoliberal hegemony? And then a more locally oriented sub-question, what are the specifically Australian contexts this kind of refusal can connect with in terms of human rights, post-colonial reparation, environmental justice, and the promotion of Indigenous and fugitive epistemologies? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Now we have Charu.
Hello, everyone. So the provocation that I gave was in the form of 2 people having a conversation about elegance and improvisation. And I gave that provocation following a YouTube video that I was watching of one of my favorite singers of Carnatic classical music. I am from southern India, born and raised in Chennai, and I'm a Carnatic classical singer, a recent migrant to Australia around 5 years ago. And I was watching Bombay Jayashree, one of my favorite artists, singing. And in Carnatic practice, we have an improvisatory form that uses meaningless syllables. They all have a meaning, but the meaning is derived in our hearts. The syllables themselves don't have a linguistic meaning. They're concatenated, like Chris said, as a syntax. But the way she sang that was, she sang a phrase, and this form is called the Raga Alapana. It's an exposition. So I'm going to give you an example because I cannot talk about music without musicking. This is a drone. So Bombay Jayashree, when she was singing, she started a phrase. And then she sat back. And she looked at the audience for exactly 30 seconds. That's it. She just stared at the audience. The violinist was waiting. The drone is sounding. Everyone's heart is in unison, just waiting. Because she could. Because she took that opportunity to make a choice. That she wasn't going to let the next utterance come out until she thought it was okay. Now, improvisation for me then is about allowing yourself the permission to do through music what you want to do and exercising choice at every instant of time. It's about social justice. And when you talk about social justice, immediately you question some of the normative structures and frameworks that keep telling us how things have to be done. And that takes us to the big question of ontoepistemology. How do we know what we know, and who gets to say what we know is the absolute way of doing something? So then that took me to the point of, okay, how about we make a mess and make mess normal? Being chaotic is normal. Madness then not becomes a state, is a refusal to conform to sanity. Why not? And so chaos, giving yourself the permission to do things when you'd like to do it, allowing for space and time to be interlocutors and mediators rather than decision makers in music. All of those spatial and temporal dimensions for me then clicked together 5 years ago when I read Darla Crispin's work, where she spoke about artistic research in terms of the word called bricolage. Now, bricolage is basically you walk into a room and then you find a lot of mess, and then you decide that that's not all bad. There's a piece of spaghetti sticking onto the wall. There might be a grape in the floor of the kitchen. And there might be a half-eaten banana sitting on the countertop. It's not all bad. At least you've got food. You're not starving. So the idea around bricolage is just bringing these disparate pieces of information or pieces of nuggets of knowledge or instances of time where soundings can happen. When you extend that metaphor from food to music, it's just identifying those points and then bringing them together in a form that makes sense. Not necessarily to someone else, but to yourself sometimes. Because I think that's self-care as well in music. Very often, as performers, we are forced to put our preferences aside when we perform for an audience. We're always curating something in reference to a context, in reference to a particular day. Today is this day. This is what you get to wear. This is the audience you'll be seeing. So, therefore, craft a repertoire. We have a repertoire. We have a table of contents. We go in with an idea. because we don't aim to please, but sometimes as a performer you are put in a place where inevitably the brain is trained to please. It's almost a colonial construct that's being somehow transmogrified into this kind of a space that keeps controlling, and so the torsion is required to crack that thing open. And sometimes a bit of madness is not all bad. So then, going from that point of a refusal, a complete acting out, I then walked into Darla's notion of bricolage, where she says, well, that chaos is the beginning then of ordering in a way that is meaningful, that in a way that is sensible, it makes sense, but also gives us a sense of well-being and nurturing. Because very often we also know that musicians are those who are very much stressed. I was, because I'm working in a context as a postdoctoral researcher that involves human flourishing, I read a lot about health and well-being these days, more than about improvisation. But I can say that some studies show that oxytocin levels are lower after a performance in professional musicians. And that for me was scary. If that is the level of stress that we are enduring as performers, what's going on here? What should we change? What could we change in the paradigm of performance to just make ourselves just a little bit looked after, to pamper ourselves? Why not? I think a bit of selfishness is required as well. And for me, that choice, going back to my first story of how I heard this piece where Bombay Jayashree was actually singing, and then she just chose to stop and look and gaze, and gave herself that time to just settle down. I think that was just my moment when I went, well, improvisation is not just about sound, it's also about claiming the power to remain silent. And with that pleading of the fifth, I think I will hand over to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charu. I'm going to claim the same right and not say anything. No, my provocation is partly self-motivated because I wanted to provoke myself to some thoughts. So I will see if I convince myself during this brief presentation to you all. And I think I'm just going to start with something a little different in response to what I've been hearing. And that is an interaction with a student I had, a young student I had some time ago when we were learning a jazz standard. And this student who had previously zero experience with jazz and improvising came to me and said, oh, I'm really struggling with improvising. I'm not sure what that's going to be and what that's going to feel like. At that point, we had been playing together collectively, and individually they'd been working on stuff. And I asked them, well, have you been playing through the music? And they said, yes. And I said, have you played it exactly the same time every single time? And they said, no. I said, have you made mistakes each time you played it? And they said, yes. I said, well, you've been improvising then, haven't you? So, all music is improvised music. And at the risk of attempting to define something that is incredibly difficult to define, here I go. Improvising is not just making stuff up on the spot. It isn't just disconnected musical utterances, even though it can often sound like that. And while it appears spontaneous, it is rather the real-time realization of hours of preparation, thought, and skill in response to and with internal and external stimulus. Improvising is something that is often seen as the domain and the ability of the jazz musician. Not so, say I. All musicians improvise. Every musician is not the same person. Every performance is not the same performance. No two audiences or venues are the same. And what improvising empowers in musicians, I think, is a personal voice on their instrument, a personal sound, and a personal relationship to the music being played or the experience that they are in, whether that music is being played solo or in an ensemble. So don't all musicians strive for that? The way one musician feels the music, or more importantly, maybe feels the spaces between the music, is different. I would argue that there is no difference between creating music and improvising music. As such, all music is improvised music. And so perhaps advancing technology and recordings have created the sense of some true performance that has been captured, a standard that we must all meet or recreate, through a process, though, that sands down or hides the individuality of the players in some way. Perhaps the way musicians are educated about improvisation and its relationship with music has created differing experiences on it. I think I could remove the word perhaps from that sentence. Has the genreification, if that's a word, or separation of genres pushed this musical concept into specific musical domains? That doesn't need to be a question. Or maybe just the fear of mistakes and failure, so pervasive in institutions and society, means that risk and improvising are seen only as the tools of the mavericks or weirdos. So what does it mean to improvise new music in a world saturated by history, information and sound? Well, firstly, surely it means to just continue to play music and to create music. That to play music in that world and in response to that world. It means that all musics are constantly being reimagined and reinterpreted as new musicians meet with them, and that new voices and new sounds and new perspectives are being included. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, I'm Hannah, and firstly I just want to reiterate an acknowledgement of the land that we're on, Yagara and Turrbal land, and the long history and ongoing struggle against colonial invasion, as well as the fact that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The only lasting truth is change here comes from a very short extract very near the beginning of a book called Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, and it's all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And this is part of a kind of creed that's written by the narrating character in that book, Lauren Oya Olamina. Improvisation is paying attention to the ways in which you are making contact via sound. All that you touch, you change. And how this alters not just some things, but everything in real time. All that you change changes you. This is vulnerable listening knowing that you are being changed and you are changing others, whether or not you're a sound-making musicer in this moment. In this way, improvised musicking can be thought of a kin-making practice, which I call music kin, that draws together all who are present. Sound makers are not human and more than human, along with the past selves and entanglements that we all come with, in a practice of active co-creation, shaping change in the present moment and into the future. Sound making as kin making is a queer gathering and relationship deepening of the thick, co-constituted, more than human existences of our holobiont selves. Holobiont just is a name for the kind of organism that we are, where we are actually dependent on sharing this space of our body with a whole lot of other organisms, a lot of microbes. So it reminds us of the thickly entangled ecosystems of our existence beyond the liberal individual idea, the ideal of the individual, the human body. In fact, doesn't exist, cannot exist without its billions of microbial co-inhabitants, bacteria, fungi, viruses, eyelash mites. Music kin is for the formation of odd kin, beyond the cis-heteronormative, what Wiradjuri scholar and my boss, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan, calls the colonial project of gender and everything else. Music kin entangles present beings in the present moment, in the present place, stolen and unceded, never ceded land, in the many ways of passively and actively participating in sound. This idea of kin-making as central to all musicking practices has created subtle but definite shifts in the ways that I think with sound making and improvisation of many kinds. The word king, K-I-N-G, is of course not an intentional component of Christopher Small's term musicking, but it is nevertheless present. And we know that in settler colonial nation states like the one in which we are situated and indoctrinated and implicated, for many of us, music has indeed been used as a colonizing tool, a king-making tool, if you will, and wielded as such by the king-makers. Each time we hear the word music used in a way that automatically assumes reference to European art music alone, we might recognize king-making take place. Further again, each time a politician dismisses minority cultural practices and critical art creation, redirecting funding instead to excellence, a stand-in term for major art organizations that specialize in keeping alive the museum performance institutions that offer multi-$100 tickets to elites, alongside the opportunity to brush shoulders with BHP and Qantas executives. By committing instead to music kin and kin-making practice, we can see the work that music does, understanding that music is not a neutral political space, and that we can choose the work that builds community and connection and relationship with and through sound making and listening and all other music kin work. It is on us to do so. After finishing my PhD last year, a queer feminist thinking of so-called free improvisation that culminated in this idea of music kin, I am now working as a postdoctoral research associate to trans non-binary Wiradjuri professor Sandy O'Sullivan at Macquarie University in Sydney on Darug land. As a settler working in an Aboriginal-led Indigenous Studies department, I am self-tasked with the complex work required to stay aware of, so responsible and able to respond to, my own subject position as a white settler. I am a musician and an artistic researcher, not an Indigenous Studies scholar, which Sandy was well aware of when they hired me. And so my practice of responsibility, for me, is a practice of music kin. Settler colonial logic is predicated on what Quandamooka scholar Prof. Eileen Morton-Robinson has identified as the white possessive, that everything can be owned and that whiteness denotes a claim to ownership. As sound makers, we can attach ourselves to our creations, our authorship of our improvised musicking. And there are real reasons for this, material reasons, such as getting payment and recognition for our work under the conditions of capitalism. But all that we sound is co-created. Dakota scholar Prof. Kim Tallbear reminds us that identity is a poor substitute for relating. We are not creating from a void, making something from nothing. Instead, we are responding and reacting to an infinitely complex array of factors, from environmental acoustics to history, to energy to expectation. Music kin involves cultivating responsibility, ability to respond, alongside our companions, listening vulnerably so that we can be responsive to the emergent relationships forming moment to moment. I am listening vulnerably to queer First Nations artists, their work and their stories, knowing that this is not a neutral act and that I'm an active participant in this art making and storytelling, actively making music, making kin, coexisting with the co-created present continuous emergence of all involved and entangled as bodies and as subjectivities. Music kin is not without trouble. It is not without continuing struggle, the struggles of being in a body, of making with and thinking with others, human and more than human, of resisting dominant modes of power, of exerting sweaty bodily effort, of relationship with what is deemed possible, the law, normative and often unspoken agreements. But in this struggle, it is in this struggle that moments of ecstatic mutuality and understanding and kin-making become possible, in which we might experience ways of making together and becoming together that evade and escape the logic of progress and the progress of logic, the advancement of a white supremacist, cis heteronormative, ableist, phallocentric and patriarchal settler colonial capitalism directed ever towards growth and inheritance, an impossible future mired in scarcity, harm, injustice and instability. By music kin, we sound make to change and be changed, to engage in an ongoing negotiation of power that shifts the balance, shifts the concentration away from those at the top and towards new entanglements that create new possibilities.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts. I think that might serve as a good launching pad for a discussion, which we probably could continue on all afternoon, but we will try not to. I'm quite interested. So there's clearly a thread of non-neutrality and politics and justice that weaves throughout the presentations. But I'm wondering, particularly in our context, particularly in a university setting, particularly in a conservatorium setting, what are the potentials of improvisation, whether it's musical improvisation, whether it's the many other kinds of improvisations that we have in work such as ours and studies such as ours? What are the potentials of that to do this music in, this responsible connection? And in what ways is that risky work?
It's super risky. I mean, it's a kind of recognition of the risks that pre-exist this. I mean, at least for me, the idea of music kin is that, like, you also can't be a passive recipient of sound, and like this means that we're constantly kind of co-creating with that environment around us. But for instance, I think of again Prof. Morton-Robinson talking about responses to her text, Talking Up to the White Woman, in which a whole bunch of sort of very well-meaning white feminist scholars wrote responses to this text going, oh, you've been a little bit harsh on us, essentially, but maybe then kind of ending their thing with some kind of self-criticism and then saying, I think the answer is just to listen to more First Nations women. To which Prof. Morton Robinson wrote, and I'm not going to be able to quote exactly because I don't have it right in front of me, but that like perpetually like listening, like inviting some token First Nations woman to get up and stand on a panel and speak, that's not enough. There's got to be some kind of ceding of power. To really listen is to acknowledge that in listening you are playing an active part. And so you can't just sort of passively sit back and let this kind of wash over you, that you have to recognize the ways that you're being changed by what you hear. And I think this is as true with words as it is with music, but with music it gives us, and with improvisation, it gives us a chance to kind of practice that, I think.
And also with
No,
silence.
I agree, and I was just going back to Alexis's question about the conservatorium and a space like a university. I think with music, there are many dimensions of it. So there's opera, there's theatre, and very often forms like opera, they're quite wedded to the text because there is that, the score and the text and the work troy and text troy dominate. And therefore, this is the allegiance to Puccini is higher than the allegiance to one's own imperative to do something creative in the spur of the moment. So if I'm singing Di quella pira, I can't do that. People will be, what? That's not what Puccini wrote. If I say I don't care, then I'll be kicked off the opera stage, likely. Thank God I'm not an opera singer. But what I'm trying to say is that improvisation needs to pervade all aspects of Western art music. For Western art music to be decolonized in the way that a lot of discourses want it to be. So I read a lot about Western music education, this decolonization has to be done, that has to be done. But when an opera is going to go on within the same way forever and ever, and every time we hear Aida, is that what we hear? We hear different people saying it. There are some minor changes, but why not go off and do something? And that takes me to the other idea that you broached briefly, Alexis, is about the body. And so gesture can be improvised. And this prefiguring and precognitive capacity of gesture, we do know that gesture is a way to impact the mood and influence the mood even before the cognitive body realizes that such a mood is being induced. So I think that giving people the agency to use gesture and to self-direct can also improve inclusivity in such a context. So I think improvisation tied to that, the idea of the body, is a powerful nexus that that can be teased out.
Go ahead, Dan.
I thought that the risk is a really interesting part within a context like this too, because there are so many levels at which risk is not welcome and is trying to be actively fought against, because risk provides space for things to go wrong.
Or differently.
But, well, that's the point, that I think if you view that situation or that event from a position of improvising or improvisation, it's not it going wrong. It's just this. It's opportunities then that are being lost and being missed or not being incorporated. And I think within a space like this, that's why you get the same opera every single time, because it's too risky to do something different. But we'll think of all the wonderful things that could occur or ways of reviewing. So I think that and the one who is improvising, or that act, is an act of risk. And that is something that for some musicians perhaps is not even thought about, but is much more, that there's no fear attached to that risk. It's just, I'm going to do that. The two players before, I'm sure there was some nerves around that, but they knew they could do it. So, but there's a huge amount of risk in that, in stepping up and playing in front of people and then playing with someone else and all of that probably wasn't thought of in that way. So maybe I think those...
And playing in the context of a discussion with people that
and
met
we're all
and
sitting
don't know what
looking at
exactly
them
is going to be
and,
said.
you know,
Yeah,
all of that stuff. So I think
contextualizing.
that the relationship of that's really interesting, and what you were saying too about creating that gap, like that's an active risk then as well to do that.
I think that relationship ties in well with what you were speaking with the minor language, and that relationship is always political, right?
Well, it connects to something that just a turn of phrase that Hannah used about the kind of, I'm paraphrasing you now, but the kind of frameworks of excellence that are imposed on us, right? and so we're very often operating within the context of somebody else's idea of what we're supposed to do. And that happens when we, you know, in the research world, we talk about, you know, Australian excellence in research or whatever it is. and you know, that some other body is determining what counts as good research. And that happens in music all the time, right? So there's these kind of impositions of what counts as a good kind of musical utterance within a certain genre formation and what doesn't, and it's a little bit unclear who is making
kind of
those
clock up
determinations.
those recognitions,
right? Yeah.
like it ends up in your bio. It's just this list of like the times other people have recognized my excellence.
Exactly, yeah. And it's all, you know, it's the very definition of hegemony where there's no, like there's not a king up at the top saying this is how it's going to be. It's that we're all already participating in the construction of what it means to be making music within a particular context. And so the improvisational move might be this kind of active resistance to that, to say, okay, I understand that. I understand like what I'm supposed to do in order to sing opera correctly or well or whatever, but what happens if I wrench that open and say, I'm going to do something else, and I'm going to do some, you know, I'm going to sing some Carnatic, melismatic expression within the middle of all of that, and then and what results from that.
And even, sorry, I'll just jump in a little on that. Just it's a long time now since I was in undergrad at this institution, but thinking in terms of the kind of like implicit competition between students, especially at that undergrad level, studying instruments, studying vocal music of various kinds, that, you know, that there's this scarcity mindset that there's only so many like places for you to, you know, audition and win where you might be a paid musician or this kind of thing. But to kind of reject that and to focus instead of building relationships with your fellow musicians, the people you're supposed to be in competition with. And I mean, even without being conscious of that at the time, I know that I made a kind of mental shift to thinking like more collaboratively with fellow flute students, and that I think was really the beginning of my improvisation practice, was like thinking more about these relationships. But it's a similar kind of resisting this mode of like excellence, instead being like, well, the relationships I have in the moment actually matter a lot. More than that.
I think that part of those understandings of where you are and what the hegemony is, in a way of like what powers are at play and where you are within that, is related to what Dan was saying, that improvised music is also not just blatherings from nowhere. It's always informed, it's always in place, in relation. You know, you have to know your craft in a way, but then either, you know, use those tools at your disposal for a active self-making or self-care or refusal or silence, and that can be incredibly active, as you were saying as well, Charu.
Yeah, I think maybe more, even more important than knowing a craft. I mean, that's one way to kind of develop in a certain direction, but it's about knowing how to respond, or like to be responsive. And in the context of playing music that was written by somebody else, and where there's some expectations set up for how you're supposed to colour the numbers of the score, then like being able to respond to unexpected events, like a quote unquote mistake, or and that's not like having a kind of set thing in your head of how you respond to this, but instead like being like really elastic and being able to, really improvise in the moment. And
And on that note,
That brings me to to a thought that sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, it brings me to a thought about Indian musical improvisation, which improvisation is a huge part of classical Indian music. And very often when the vocalist is improvising or going off on a flow, the supporting violinist will completely be silent and supporting, foundational, nurturing, caring, scaffolding, all of those things. So I think in improvisation, sometimes we got to know when to listen, but also know when to quietly support, be an ally, also not overshadow, but really allow for voices to emerge. But the vocalist then cedes that power, and that it's not like now it's your turn. It just dies down, and then the violinist will take their turn. So it's about also just resting and the other person taking ownership. So it's a very subtle,
like a reciprocity.
Yeah, it's a very subtle power play, but that's very respectful. What I find is that improvisation as a philosophy would work even in politics. And even in conversations in families, in conflict resolution, in peacemaking. Because very often we find voices are shouting over each other and no one is heard enough. So I think there's an application for improvisation in music, but also beyond paramusical, extra musical levels. And in education, Alexis, you know this. I mean, more than anyone here. I guess you've kind of lived it in terms of. Can you tell us something about what you think? It's dangerous to call me as a panelist because I will turn against you.
I would, but we might be here all afternoon. And I would like to open up the floor also if we have any questions, just especially ones that will turn us upside down and inside out and take us to task on really not expecting what's coming. Glenn.
I just want to go back to what Dan said about music is improvisation. What I'm hearing is about, I guess, tradition and contemporary. And the original music was improvisation, correct me if I'm wrong, but the original score was improvisation until we repeat it and copy it and paste it, Control-C, Control-V. So where is, I guess, the sense of aesthetic from the creative side of things to bring a sense of self into improvisation as compared to trying to copy the original, if that makes sense?
Totally.
Yeah, that's a good question. Where is the, did you say intention?
The sense of self in creativity, in improvisation.
I think it's in the self, it's in the person doing it. I would say, but I think it's the things around that self that allow that to be discovered or uncovered perhaps for that person. And I think it's a little bit like the excellence idea, or that idea of trying to achieve something that's actually not really connected to you or yourself. And this then an internalized kind of false relationship by, if I then do that, then I will be myself. Whereas the kind of not necessarily rejecting all of that, but just the awareness of that, and then realizing, oh, okay, it's within me somehow, and having to work on that. And I don't know if that's a great answer or not, or a helpful answer, but I think that might be my answer to that.
I think there's a bit from like each.
Yeah,
I'm thinking like the alchemy that Chris spoke of, the bricolage, and also the sense that all music is improvisation, that like there's kind of the sense of self is always like, I mean, I definitely think co-constituted with the relationships that you're in that moment, but it's all the relationships you bring into that situation. And so, it's this ongoing conversation you're having with your past selves of 5 minutes ago, of 20, 30, 50 years ago, and it's you kind of gathering those like pieces in that moment, whether instinctually or really consciously, and like kind of in conversation with those pieces as well as with the things that you're in that moment. But of course, each sound maker in that instance brings their own collection of those pieces to that moment. Yeah.
But the gathering also, I think, self, if I were to say, it's a journey that the self takes. In improvisation, the selfhood is actualized. So you have this narrative around selfhood and personhood. I think that self-actualization is a journey, and improvisation can kind of get you to a spot. But it's a moving target. Mm-hmm. You're playing with yourself. That self needs to be, that is reconfigured as you move along.
Yeah.
And it's a game.
And it's that internal stuff. And I think there's two thoughts I have as well. One is from a learning or an educational or systemic thing. There's actually nothing wrong with learning other stuff and having that in terms of trying to sound like what's on the page or whatever. But I think it's then being able to have a moment in yourself to be like, okay, that's why I'm doing that. And then what of that do I want to constitute within myself? And then there was a second point that I have forgotten.
Yeah.
It was a really good
It was
one.
brilliant, I know.
Yeah, it was a good one. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I'll just pile on maybe all of this just a little bit. So on one hand, trying to sort out where the self is in all of this, right? And so if we take from the perspective that Hannah just gave us, the self is a quite incredibly complex thing that doesn't end at our skin, and that even within our skin is not just us, because there's lots going on in there that is the more than the human of what ourselves are. So in addition to that, there's this idea that that ourselves are socially and ideologically constructed. So the discovery of oneself is both a process of coming to recognize how we are constructed through these social forces, and also constructing ways of resisting those forces when we feel like we ought to be resisting those forces. And so again, to use the language I was using before, that's where that break could occur, the break in the willful disidentification with the way in which you have been taught yourself is supposed to be. And so that's something that's so important within the context of a music conservatory, for example, where so many people come here thinking, I'm this kind of a musician. I'm showing up here, and and I am, I'm an oboe player, and I'm on this path, and I'm going to do these things, and I've kind of had explained to me exactly what steps I need to take in order to achieve excellence and get the gig, right? But of course, there's no gig anymore. And so what is the gig anymore? It's not that coveted orchestral position unless you're one in a million. And so the gig is something else. And that something else is really vast and really is constantly in motion. And so what are the ways in which what are the structures we can create within an institution like this for those paths toward new forms of selfness, to be constantly emerging and constantly re-interacting with all of the other selves and all of the other oddkin and things like that are that we're co-constituting ourselves with, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I think this is a nice way to end, in a way, in thinking also that improvisation is then not necessarily a projection of the self. The self is improvised and is improvisation. So I'd like to thank our panelists very, very much for sharing your thoughts and the discussion, and for asking questions, and our musicians. And thank you all for coming.